Okay, time to resume. Time to resume for the last but not least session of the day. Welcome back. Delighted to have you for this session on the first day of this 2 days conference. And we are very, very fortunate to have with us Adam Tooze here today. Adam needs no introduction, but let me try all the same. His reputation, of course, precedes him. He is both a historian and an economist, which I think gives a particular perspective. Professor at Columbia University, the Kathleen and Selby Cullum Davis Professor of History, and the Director of the European Institute at Columbia. Adam has very kindly agreed to give a keynote speech. We are very fortunate, and he will take us really 11 feet up to take the very ambitious topic of the international economic order in an age of a polycrisis. And knowing that Adam has actually coined the term polycrisis, we really look forward to hearing from him. In terms of format, we'll have about 30 minutes or so presentation, followed by Q&A. So please stay tuned and prepare questions so we can have what I'm sure will be a very lively and exciting and perhaps even controversial debate. So Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I apologize for dropping in the middle of the afternoon. I've actually just been across the road in the hotel. It's a teaching day in Columbia in New York, so I've been Zoom teaching and mercifully the time difference lines up, and I'm between seminars right now. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I also come with a degree of diffidence because I am very far from, no one's ever going to confuse me with being an expert in development economics, but I find the dialogue between the general effort to locate our moment in global political economy and the development community is a silo that's these silos need crossing, and it's a privilege to engage in that effort with you this afternoon. I have been able to listen to some of the conversations this morning, and I gather I'm being kind of used as a hinge between the more technical finance ministry fiscal stuff today and some other issues tomorrow, so I'm very happy to play that role. Forgive me if some of this is a little higher than 11 feet. I think I'd be like 11,000 might be closer to the mark. I'm very happy to bring things down to earth in the Q&A. I had the benefit as a keynoter of being given a very clear agenda, very clear instructions from ODI on what you would like me to talk about. It's extraordinarily helpful. And this is the 6-point list of issues that it would be great to. I mean it. This is great. So, what is a polycrisis? How does it affect the global South? How do you view the relations between US and China in shaping the international order? Are there comparisons to be made between current reform efforts and those of the 1970s? What should policy be? And then what should a Labour government do? I can approach these questions in sort of descending order of expertise, so I feel relatively competent at the top and increasingly out of my depth at the bottom. And so I'm going to kind of halt halfway through, and then we'll turn to Q&A. What is a polycrisis? I mean, I picked up the term from Jean-Claude Juncker almost as a kind of willful act of kind of intellectual provocation. To cite the president of the European Commission as the source of a big idea seemed like a kind of a thing to do. He himself took it from Edgar Morin, a French theorist of complexity, who had coined it in the late 1990s. I think it means essentially 3 things. It's characterizing the world in terms of a diversity of shocks: ecological, economic, political, geopolitical, and insisting on the heterogeneity of these. I sometimes liken it to the experience of going to a particularly badly sorted breakfast buffet, where like every conceivable option is available. You can see people piling up, the Chinese buns and the American bacon and the American, so polycrisis has this kind of heterogeneous feel, and it breaks our norms about what crises should look like. We're confronted with combinations. Any sense of a heterogeneity is, after all, based on an underlying assumption of norms, which is being challenged. And one of the things that's happening is that economic and non-economic factors are being mixed together and then being mixed all the way down, right, at every single level. I mean, if you're trying to diagnose the current inflation problem, you end up starting with an epidemic or a pandemic even. And that's what I take to be characteristic of the polycrisis moment. You could ask, I'm a historian, I'm labeled as a historian, so the obvious question I always get is, is a coincidence of multiple crises like this really a new phenomenon? And of course, the answer is no. Every revolutionary moment at some level has been characterized by this. But Chris Clark's great book on 1848 that's just come out literally ends with a claim that the 19th century, the mid-19th century saw something like a polycrisis, out of which emerged, after all, the theory of Marxism. But you could also think of the interwar period, about which I've written, as a moment of polycrisis, where you have coming together economic and international relations forces, the disruption of political norms. I think it's clear that any crisis like that is overdetermined in that sense, but I don't think we should be shy. I think we should insist, I think we should regard these kind of comments not necessarily as helpful, in the sense that I feel that they're a little defensive. They're warding off what I think is a more awesome reality, which is the possibility that the current moment is unprecedented, truly is unprecedented. And this wisdom, and I feel the role of a historian here is quite ambiguous, because on the one hand, the historian could be reminding us always that we've seen this before. But I think at some point you've also got to say that, no, actually we haven't. The Cold War had created destruction of economic growth, disrupted technological change, mounting geopolitical crisis, political conflict. It had all of those things. But we do need, I think, to encompass the fact that there has never, ever, literally never, ever in history been a state as large and as powerful as the current Chinese state. Ever. In the history of our species has 1.4 billion people all been organized at the level that China is. No state of that size has risen as fast as China has in the last generation. And no rising power has ever faced an antagonist as formidable as the United States, as globally established and as convinced of its own exceptional mission in history as the United States, even in its current attenuated form, is. That, I think, is a novel configuration. We shouldn't confuse that with other moments. Nor have we ever faced a reality in which we are up against, our noses are being forced into, literally, if we're willing to, as it face the reality of the imminence of real environmental crisis on a global scale as a lived reality. And there's a way in which I think we constantly repress this, the way in which, for instance, the COVID crisis and policy responses to the COVID crisis have been normalized as instances of dramatic fiscal policy action. Whereas what we were actually dealing with this is the daily plotting of global GDP by Goldman Sachs in 2020. That's a 20% collapse in global GDP, not over a matter of years, which is what happened between 1929 and 1932, but a matter of weeks. A 20% fall in global GDP. We literally, in the annals of economic history, have never seen anything like this, or had to map it like this before, or had the capacity to map it. Now, one could quibble about indicators like this, but they seem to me to graphically capture a kind of volatility on a scale that we just have never seen before. We've never attempted simultaneously to furlough a very large percentage of the global workforce running into the billions at the same moment. There's never ever been anything like this before. And of course, to an extent, the polycrisis is also the experience of kind of a virtual reality, right? But that in itself is significant. Modernity generates, habitually, systematically produces forward-looking visions. That's one of the things we've learned to do with social science since the 18th century. And those forward indicators for us right now allow us to draw maps like this, which tell us that by 2070, that black band across the middle of our planet will become largely uninhabitable. Now, that may transpire or not, and we may devise mechanisms for living with it, but we have never collectively faced a future like that before. That too strikes me as qualifying the current moment as novel. Nor have we been in a situation where, at the level, if you like, almost of sort of philosophy of history, we have had to reckon with facts like this, that Earth scientists genuinely believe that the planet may have been shifted off its axis by the scale of human activity. Like, this is not in the run-of-mill of previous human activity. And furthermore, it's not just something that's happening. We have an acute consciousness of it. In other words, we can't evade the responsibility. Right? It's not just it's not just in itself. It's for itself. It's moved into the realm of a kind of collective cultural reckoning with the scale of our impact. Now, for some, the realization of this is an implication that we basically need to do more and more complicated planning. We need to do more and more complicated modeling. We need to expand our models to incorporate a wider variety of range. And I think that's absolutely, God help us, we need that, right? That's our only hope. We need to do more sophisticated technocratic planning for sure. But for me, as somebody coming from the humanities who doesn't bear the responsibility of policy making, the other thing we need to reckon with is, and I think it's the role for folks like myself in that privileged position, is also to kind of continuously remind ourselves of the kind of cognitive shock that this implies, the scale of the uncertainty that's being generated. And I don't just say this for myself, who am I after all, but take Larry Summers, surely the most confident of the exponents of the 1990s, and he and Martin Wolf went to lunch and they ended up talking about the polycrisis. And as Larry says, he and I disagree about very many things, but the polycrisis term strikes him as a useful one for describing what, in his modest estimation of his 50 years of tracking world affairs, is not the most dangerous necessarily. Polycrisis is not a prediction of imminent disaster. It's not a Malthusian nightmare. It's simply saying we're going to have to run faster to keep up intellectually, in policy terms, maybe even emotionally, with the pace of change and with the scale of change. What he's saying is he's never felt more confused. I think that is a rather telling indicator of the state they're in. You could ask at this point whether this isn't a reworking of one of the fashionable memes of the 2008 financial crisis. Many of you will remember the books that came out afterwards. Oh, look, a huge financial crisis happened. Well, that probably reminds us of the fact that, as Keynes very wisely said 100 years ago, there are things which are fundamentally uncertain to which we cannot attach probabilities. And so there was this sort of reassertion of the epistemic modesty implied by this recognition that our ability to calculate probabilities was limited, and so we needed to reckon with something that is called radical uncertainty. And that gets kind of to the outcome. I do think we are facing a kind of radical uncertainty, but whenever I invoke this Keynesian piece of wisdom, I always have this kind of worry. Is it really true that the world is difficult to calculate as an almost metaphysical proposition? Is this a philosophical truth that we discover? Or is this ultimately a political fact about the world? This is where my kind of leftism and my inheritance of the Marxist tradition comes from. The capitalist world is unpredictable, but that's not because the world per se has to be unpredictable. It's because of the way we built it. If you take Keynes's example, the sense in which I'm using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain. There's no scientific basis to form any calculable probability. Well, that's setting a very high bar. Might we just be able to make some kind of reasonable claim about whether war is more or less likely? Well, if we can't do that, it might be to do with the fact that we just don't have a security architecture, right? That makes war less calculable, right? So in a sense, the question is this more political or philosophical? I'm really inspired by it. I really recommend this essay to everyone interested in this problem by my friend Natasha Leonard, who teaches in New York, on the Verso website, about the politics of the attribution of certainty and uncertainty in the current moment. Because I think this metaphysical move of the Keynesian type is a cop-out. The problem with 2008 financial crisis was not that there is irreducible radical uncertainty in the world. It's very, very bad bank regulation and extremely dangerous strategies by highly leveraged players in a market-based financial system. That enormously increases the range of uncertainty. If you have, Lehman repo funded to the tune of 600 billion a night, you've got some uncertainty in the system, but it's not a metaphysical proposition. So polycrisis, for me, describes the production through the radical process of development itself of an expanding zone of new unknowns. So radical uncertainty is not simply a given, it's produced. It's a radicalization of modernity that we're actually facing. Mark Blythe, my friend Brown, puts it brilliantly in an article in The Guardian 2 years ago. As he describes it here, climate breakdown, of course induced by human economic development, is a giant non-linear outcome generator with wicked convexities. In plain English, there's no mean, there's no average, there's no return to normal. It's one-way traffic into the unknown. So this is produced uncertainty. It's not a given, it's not a fact about the world. This is what I think the polycrisis term is trying to capture. So what are the implications for the global south? How will the polycrisis affect the prospects of development going forward? So when I was invited to WISER at WITS in South Africa earlier this year, Keith Breckenridge, my friend there, the great historian of data and personal identification, said, Adam, literally as I arrived in the airport, he said, Adam, I like this polycrisis concept, but hasn't Africa been in polycrisis for the last half century? Isn't this a radically Eurocentric conception that suddenly we've entered this phase? And you can obviously see what he means, right? The failure of industrialization between the 70s and the 90s, the Cold War, the spilling over to Africa with massive force, HIV/AIDS, the first pandemic of the modern era, so often written out of those stories, right? Because not transmitted by air, but sexually transmitted, and because Africa is just outside the imaginary. We think of pandemics coming from Asia. And then, of course, the breakout of radical Islam in East Africa, notably in Somalia and Sudan in 89 and 91. Right, so you can see where we're coming from here. I buy that, But I think the first point to say is that polycrisis, the idea is not challenging us to sort of decide whether the present is better or worse, or whether we're on a narrative of progress or decline, the kind of Afro-pessimism, Afro-optimism kind of story. But it's really asking us about novelty, right? And within the drama of Africa's development over the last half century, as dramatic as that first phase is, I would want to insist, not that things have gotten better or worse, but that things have added complexity and become more dramatic over time. In other words, the African crisis itself has an internal history which is extremely dynamic and constantly changing. It's not just one thing. You could say, I think, maybe the appropriate claim is that Africa first enters polycrisis and now finds, as it were, the rest of the world catching up with it and sucking it into further spirals. But we shouldn't. I think we should, for all of a desire to shrink away from neo-Malthusian pessimism, we have to reckon, surely, with the world historic drama of, on the one hand, Africa's population growth, which is a world historic innovation, right? The recovery of Africa's population from the impact of slavery is unlike the recovery of Asia, which was always densely populated, right? This is a new phenomenon. A relatively densely populated African continent is a new thing in world history. The combination of that with the escalating environmental breakdown, which is captured so well by this map, and many of the places in the black zone there have the highest population growth rates in the world, right? That is a novel configuration, even in the last half century story of Africa's development. That's the first point to make. The second point to make is that the conditions under which the global South, and I'm just using Africa here as a placeholder for that, the global South has to face the future and its development are, of course, radically changed by the shifting external environment. In other words, Asia's emergence changes the conditions, and notably China's, East Asia's emergence changes the conditions for everywhere else, including, of course, India. And then I think there's another phenomenon that we have to deal with, which is, as it were, a historicity element, a story internal to the development of this drama, which is that at some point we begin to have to reckon with the iterative nature of the development, disappointment, restart, development, disappointment cycle. I was really struck by this talking to South African colleagues or people in Argentina, friends in Argentina as well, where the message is, it's worse this time because we no longer believe, right? Because we are going through successive cycles, and each time there is a reboot, and each time you make this move, this exhausts its credibility. Now, in societies with really dramatically young populations, this effect is less extreme. But in both South Africa and Argentina, I felt this very powerfully. The way in which a polycrisis, even if you can think of it extended, changes shape as the experience of this relentless permacrisis digs itself deeper into the world. And this is a theme that I want to harp on in the last half of what I'm going to say today, because I think to a degree it affects the West, the global North as well. There is a sense in which facing this crisis, and one of the dramas of facing this crisis, is a kind of crisis of credibility, you might call it, if you're coming from the economic side. How credible is the commitment that we're actually now going to mobilize on the scale that we need? And how exhausted are we by repeated failures to meet that promise? And I think this is something that no doubt speaks to folks in Britain. More consequentially, on a historical scale, it speaks to people in the United States very powerfully. This sense of, are we really going to iterate? Is that what we have to do? And that, as it bites its way in, becomes a dramatic force. I don't want to end this segment, though, on a negative note, because I think the polycrisis, and notably the most obvious answer to the polycrisis from the climate side, the energy transition, is the narrative of a very different type. Because I think the energy transition is really, seems to me, at least in rhetorical and political terms, to be a huge gift to the development project as such, because it doesn't have that exhausted feel. It doesn't have the sense of another restart, another cycle of mobilization, expectation, and disappointment. It has the effect of connecting in a common problem, both the very rich and the very poor. Its focus is on investment, innovation, and just attention on an issue which is absolutely essential for the poorest. In other words, how do we get more energy to more people? It is not so high tech as to be exclusive, like smartphone production. It's not obvious you can do it in Arizona. It's not obvious you can do it anywhere outside of Taiwan. At the most, that's like wine growing. solar and wind don't seem to have that kind of logic. They seem more extendable. It clearly requires large-scale employment, if not in the operation of the facilities, then in the construction and the rolling out. And it redistributes the cards. And it redistributes the cards, as we can see from any map of solar and wind potential, in a really dramatic way. Now, nothing positive is given by this. There is no determinacy here. Everything depends on politics and how this opportunity is exploited or not exploited. But it changes the game in a really positive way. And I think that, against the backdrop of that disillusionment, which I think is increasingly a big problem, that's very promising and has to be seized on as a huge opportunity for those people of good faith and huge resilience and patience who are grinding at the problem, the boring of hard boards of global development. This is a gift, because this is a redefinition of the problem. You can see the way people's, in Brussels, in Berlin, people's sense of geography is expanding. All of a sudden, North Africa becomes a strategic zone, not just a problem from which migrants come. The shift in, this is soft tissue stuff. And of course, it involves an instrumentalization more often than not of the global south for various purposes, but it's a claim on relevance that is really novel. And I think is a huge opportunity. In other words, the polycrisis, again, to go back to this theme, doesn't seem to me fate, right? It's not doom. It's a series of high stakes political wagers and gambles, and this is a tactical opportunity to exploit with strategic implications. The next question that was asked is, how do you view the changing economic strategies and relations between the US and China? And these are obviously directly related to the geopolitics of the energy transition. There are folks in Africa, there are folks in Washington, D.C. who finally care about the location of strategic raw materials all over the world, in Latin America and elsewhere, in a way that they never did before. But there's three things I really, if I'm shy about my credentials in talking to an audience like this about development problems, there are three things which, somewhat to my surprise, I have found myself exposed to on the American side, which I do think are really worth bringing to an audience like this, as a way perhaps of sort of helping you to shape expectations about next year, America's prospects, and so on, parametric to the central things that you're thinking about. And this is what I want to, I'm not going to talk about China because it's so opaque, and even the Chinese experts that I know and speak to regularly have huge difficulty actually gauging what's going on there. Maybe there are folks in this room who have other connections that make that work. On the American side, the astonishing thing is how leaky the apparatus currently is, how quickly a sense of crisis is communicated to the outside, and how openly that sense of crisis is communicated to the outside. And some of it's instrumental communication, of course, but some of it is actually kind of unfiltered. And the most dramatic thing, really stomach churning, from earlier this year, was the sense that we have just lived through in the first half of this year, we lived through the first genuine full-on war scare of the new Cold War. And I mean that, and I can't emphasize this strongly enough in an audience like this. Very serious men and women in Washington, D.C. in the first 4 to 5 months of this year were bracing for the possibility of military confrontation with China in 2025. Explicitly and on that timetable from the very highest level, and uninhibitedly communicating with journalists in the Beltway and beyond about the nature of those conversations. And I put Ed Luce up here because Ed Luce is somebody who is directly tapped in. So when you read him in the Financial Times and he publishes an article like this, it's because he's spoken to Milley, Chief of Joint Staff, or Ed Sullivan, not Ed Sullivan, and Jake Sullivan. Right? It's because this sort of messaging that you're seeing here is coming directly from inside the Beltway, to the extent that this kind of piece produces then a summons to the White House for explanation and further comment. So there are ways in which folks outside the system can, as it were, track what's going on, but only indirectly, but nevertheless in quite a vivid form. And the reality is, and it's really sort of shocking. I don't think I've ever been quite as scared as after a meeting with highly placed people in the National Security Council. The reality of military preparation for confrontation over Taiwan was absolutely real, and on a time horizon of 18 months. That's a kind of framing parameter. The next framing parameter, which you should have in mind when you think about medium-term global prospects, is that the American political system is broken in fundamental ways, which the last 2 or 3 years have papered over. because of the unexpectedly good midterm results and Biden's narrow victory in 2020. But the extent of the damage is spectacular. It's ongoing, and it will resurge to the top of the global headlines next year. But it should be in everyone's mindset, everyone's calculative set. All of your tail risks should include the possibility of a really dramatic political development in the United States. Right now, the House Republicans are calling for a 45% cut to the USAID budget. Now, they do this ritually, but this is an upping of the ante from a previous demand for a cut of 25 to 30%. And it's unclear to what extent the Republican leadership in Congress any longer fully has control over their caucus. The risks of a government shutdown in the United States at any given moment are real, and this is one of the political footballs that they play with. And the depth, and you might think this is just a kind of the depth of political dysfunction here. So let's make it personal and let's bring it down. And these are data from the FT, which many of you will see, but it's worth just lingering over their meaning. By the metric of vaccine resistance, the American Republican Party is by far and away the most radical of all of the populist parties in the Western world. By the metric of vaccine resistance. There are the AfD, the French right wing, and there are the Republican Party on the left-hand side there. The Republicans are literally dying for their beliefs. This is COVID mortality by party affiliation in the United States. That's tens of thousands of people dying in the Republican camp on the grounds of their affiliation. So this 45% cut to the USAID budget, it's political theater, but it's political theater from people who have truly extraordinary views of the world, which they translate into action, right? So there's some sort of way in, because I think because of the COVID restrictions, few Europeans were actually directly exposed to the political drama of 2020. I've never in my life lived through anything as dramatic or unsettling. It was just completely unclear whether the Republicans were going to recognize the arithmetic outcome of the election. Just fully unclear whether that was going to happen. And if you ever ask yourself why Biden had to be the candidate, because now they're going to run him, even though he's clearly at some point going to be incapable of doing the job, the alternative was Sanders. And if Sanders had been the candidate, it's very unclear, I think, how the political forces in the United States would have arranged themselves, A, whether he could have won against Trump, and B, if he had, whether the configuration of forces around him would have ensured that the transition of power happened. In any other country in the world, anyway, we would be asking this question. And that is the reality that we're going into in the United States next year. This is the polling as of today. And as you can see, in the majority of polls, Trump handily beats Biden. Handily beats Biden. In fact, any Republican candidate, Haley in particular, crushes Biden systematically in this polling. So not only are these extreme views out there, not only are these extreme views like fundamentally damaging to the American constitutional apparatus, it's very unclear how a Trump presidency, for instance, would deal with the military command chain, given their experience at the hands of the American soldiers in 2020. And the polling suggests right now that it's going to be at the very least an absolutely nail-biting year next year. So that is what to brace for. I'm not predicting the outcome. I'm not crazy, but the reality is we're going to live through extraordinarily uncertain times. And that, for this community, has huge consequences because it constrains all of the economic policy making. You have to understand what Sullivan and Bauchi and Yellen and all of the heroes of Biden economics are doing as part of a Democratic Party elite strategy to give themselves the courage to go into this system because they know that everything is at stake. Right? They are at least profoundly convinced that the entire future of the American Republic is at stake in this project. And that is crucial to understand. So the IRA, for instance, which is celebrated as a historic policy initiative and is the largest in US history, this is the Inflation Reduction Act, the big green industrial policy program, was in fact an absolutely nail-biting last-minute congressional deal with the nerves of large parts of the congressional staff breaking down in the first 2 weeks of July. People were crying in the corridors of power. It was literally, and then finally a deal between Manchin and Schumer is done. The White House had virtually no input into the political process because it was simply too dangerous for Biden's reputation. So people refer to this as Biden's policy. That's a triumph of Biden's spin doctoring after the fact. It's a re-assimilation of a program that was largely done in Congress. It's far smaller in scale than the hype would suggest, and it relies on the fuzzy math of public-private blended finance multipliers to get itself to the $2 to $3 trillion scale. And again and again and again, you have to remind yourself to divide by 10, because this is a 10-year program. So it's a fraction of 1% of American GDP that's actually been mobilized here. And according to European internal estimates, the running subsidies offered in the Netherlands, for instance, for green energy programs are 8 times those available through the IRA. Now, there's a huge amount that's attractive about the IRA. It's very easy to access. The money's quick. There's very little paperwork. But you have to understand it as part of this effort by the Biden team to do something, to act into history at this moment when they absolutely have to. If you go beyond this, it's quite clear that the United States has 0 trade policy options. They simply can't table it. They have very limited development policy options. I'll show you a slide on that in just a second. They have really a serious problem of trust and credibility in Latin America, despite their interventions, or rather their efforts to stabilize the transition in Brazil. They got 0 love for this and are extremely upset about it. Biden is boxed in on Haiti, given his own previous position, which is the development crisis on America's doorstep, which ought to be, you'd think, an absolute priority of American policy and just never breaks the surface. You'll see it's in the order of a couple of $100 million in the USAID appropriation. Central America, which is the driver of the immigration crisis, which sits on Americans' doorstep, was handed out to Kamala Harris, which gives you a sense of what the priority is, and she wants nothing to do with it. The result is that immigration policy is being increasingly securitized. There are large parts of the congressional GOP which actively discuss bombing Mexico, with a view to eliminating the drug cartels they blame for the destabilization. Now, of course, they're not going to do that, but the Parliament of the United States includes people who actively discuss military intervention in Mexico. This is part of the reality. Geopolitics emerges as the lowest common denominator of this political system. On China, the administration does have congressional backing, but what we've seen since that panic earlier in the year, when the Biden administration insiders realized that they were becoming dangerously close to actually triggering war, is this pullback. And the central theme of the pullback has been de-risking rather than uncoupling, adopting the European term. And then this phrase, small yard, high fence, which is how they justify massively aggressive strategy on tech, with a view then to saying, well, in all other areas of economic policy, we're all good. We can continue with a liberal order. It obviously lacks credibility. Its boundaries are unilaterally defined, and it's damaging to business confidence in any case. You know, watching Yellen go to China recently, it was like watching somebody with massive cognitive dissonance. I mean, she is, after all, a classic exponent of 90s globalism. And there she is in China having to defend the line, literally, that Washington favors growth for China in absolutely every area, except for all of those which matter for strategic competition. And that's the position. Right? And impeding chip development and AI couldn't possibly have anything to do with China's long-run economic growth, even though the United States at the same time is doubling down on the view that it's absolutely essential to America's long-run economic growth. It's just a fundamentally inconsistent position that lacks credibility, and her reputation is just being sacrificed again and again and again in these efforts to square a circle which doesn't square. In Washington, if you speak to the WTO leadership, they basically say the good news is they still pay their dues. Right? When America really doesn't care about a global institution, they stop paying their dues. Washington still pays its dues, but it openly scores. Its response on the steel tariffs was just contemptuous. What they favor are plurilateral coalitions of the willing. This is at the end of the Jake Sullivan Brookings speech. There is this efforts to map out what a multilateral American policy would look like. But basically, the funding is soft for those kind of initiatives, and they avoid all of the tough issues that would be involved. And amongst the rich country partners in the anti-China coalition, it's all played out anyway. There's very little to be gained from free trade conversations with South Korea and Japan, other than if America introduces the IRA, which excludes them, and so then the Americans can make concessions. So there is this sort of effort to craft a policy to fill a gap. This is the 70.5 billion foreign affairs fiscal appropriation for 2024. Most of this is USAID money. And the numbers, you know, there's a common theme here. They're between $1 and $3 billion, and they're for a bunch of really grandiose projects. So we've got the infrastructure fund to make game-changing investments in the Indo-Pacific. We have the energy plan for development for 500 million people in developing countries to have clean energy. We have the Trump's International Development Finance Corporation with an extra allocation of $2 billion. We've got $1 billion to address the root causes of migration in Central America and $291 million for Haiti. On the one hand, what you see here is the kind of collective hive mind, the intelligence of American policymaking in action. They see all of the problems that everyone sees, and they're trying to allocate money to all of them. But what you also see is the cap, the limit. Remember the two $2 billion figure. Think about the statements they've been making recently on the World Bank, right? Go to G20, the American project is to restart and expand World Bank lending. The headline figure is 200 billion over 10 years, 200 billion, but that's the headline figure. How are they going to get there? America's contribution turns out is 25 billion. You're going to get to 200 by somehow leveraging private and partnerships with your allies around the world. That gets you at least, arguably, the FT reported to 100 billion from the Europeans and the Americans and maybe some other G70 players. So we're talking in the three-figure billions part. What are you going to ask Congress for? 2.25. So you're going to leverage that up to a pot, which will be a first risk cover on the American side of maybe 20 billion. Then you're going to do some other math, and you're going to expect yourself going to get to 50 billion. What we're seeing here is an administration that is very creatively playing every single register on its policy instrument, but is operating within a political framework in which the possible ask from Congress is 2.25 for the World Bank, smuggled into an appropriation of 10 times that for Ukraine in the current Congress, and they've got no idea whether they can actually do this. So in conclusion, the 3 points to make about America's policy are it's massively constrained by political antagonism. It relies, as my friends on the critical development studies wing would say, again and again and again on the billions into trillions, blended finance, what Daniela Gabor calls the Wall Street consensus vision of development. In other words, public funds are limited, and so we have to wave the wand of securitization or some sort of backstop mechanism to get us to big numbers, right? But the real issue, and if you confront the folks in the White House with this, they're absolutely conscious of this, is that it is an order of magnitude at least short of what everyone acknowledges is actually the required level of investment spend globally, right? These are the estimates from Stern et al. You can multiply these. Everyone in the room will be familiar with the scale of these. These are from Stern et al., Grantham Center, LSE, the stuff that was done for the latest COPs. These are the kind of spending figures. We know 4 trillion for the world for sustainable development. In the emerging market and low-income space, ex-China, it's 1 trillion, give or take 1.5. You can break it down in different ways. And when you confront folks in the White House with this fact, which they are plainly familiar with, they just shrug. They literally just shrug in a pained way and say, well, that's what we can do. When you look at how this is going to be done, and this brings us back to conversations I know that you were having earlier on, this is the way in which Stern et al. Figure what they call the grand match. So this is going to be some kind of blended finance element. They openly acknowledge the need for public financing. Then there's going to be a private flow. There's going to be an expansion of multilateral lending, concessional lending, and aid. That gets us into the ballpark. We all know that these in relation to global GDP are eminently manageable numbers. The question is what global GDP is for these purposes and how you coordinate and organize it. The salient fact that I was going to pick out from here is the domestic resource mobilization element, which is the big yellow bar on the left. And that goes directly to the heart of your conversations this morning, also about the fiscal apparatus, because ultimately this whole stack depends on the fiscal capacity of the low-income and developing countries to service this debt. And ultimately, it depends on that element, and that brings us to the structure of taxation and the range of possible options in terms of taxation. Because an element of it can be handled through risk sharing and de-risking in the West. An element of it can be done on a concessional basis. But in the long run, the vision clearly of all of this is global financial development, which implies the building of a tax apparatus, a domestic bond market, a local capital market. It's essentially a kind of global financial revolution argument, which dare not speak its name, but has that kind of implication. And the foundation of that, as we know from European history, is taxation. If you've got the tax base, you can float a large public debt. And that will also be the test of our debt burden sustainability going forward in the United States, where we're looking, as a result of this political impasse, at deficits in the US. Just to put this in your kind of set of parameters, all the estimates for American deficits run to 4 to 5% of GDP, continuing for the next decade. So that is going to be the big weight on the global bond market, is absorbing all of that treasury issuance. Everything else will fit around it. One of the reasons why I think many people think interest rates are going to stay higher for longer is that. So what am I saying in conclusion? Polycrisis is not fate, right? It's the product of known processes of growth and development that produce a funnel, an ever greater funnel of uncertainty, of drama, and a constant shift of all the parameters, right? We know, we at least have prepared reasonable estimates of what it will take to give everyone on this planet a fighting chance of dealing with it. That's what the Sustainable Development Goals are about. They're not a guarantee of anything. They're not a guarantee of equality, but they at least give folks a fighting chance. And they were promulgated at the same time as the Paris Agreement. It's astonishing the extent to which one is prioritized in the global policy agenda, net zero targets for 2050 and whatever, and the Sustainable Development Goals exist in an entirely different space. Nothing that we're currently doing comes close to meeting the scale of the challenge. We're an order of magnitude off, broadly speaking. None of the current agenda items do that. And that disconnect between the affirmation of growth, which we know drives the crisis, and the plans for the response, and the failure repeatedly to, in the face of known parameters, to rise to that, has necessarily to lead to, I think, a crisis of credibility at some point. That was the burden of the FT piece I did about Niger a few weeks ago. It's just that, why are we having this conversation about why we quote lost the Sahel? It's like we weren't even breaking a sweat in terms of actually mobilizing material resource for development. So what are the options going forward from here? How does one formulate a kind of rational, critical position? And this is my final kind of gesture to your question about the Bridgetown agenda. It seems to me there are three ranges of policy options that we might think of pursuing. One is the overall structural realignment, reform of the global economy. That's a 70s vision. That's off the agenda. There's a one-way traffic in that kind of vision from the 80s onwards. And we are not out of the neoliberal world from the point of view, if you look at the blended finance kind of vision, what Daniela calls the big green state is off the agenda, right? We heard it very loud and clear at Glasgow when the climate finance issue was so clearly formulated. Kerry said it, it's not coming from public budgets. Here or in China, there's some sort of public-private partnership. So then the smart money seems to be on very cleverly designed strategies to adjust and manipulate and improve and reallocate the existing pots of money in very fundamental ways. And that's how I see the Bridgetown agenda. It's like it's a powerfully successful effort to, at least at the level of rhetoric and of public attention globally, to figure out a better allocation of resources. But fundamentally, it's still operating within the framework of the given, right? But to that extent, it seems to me to fit quite neatly with what the Biden folks are trying to do. Its scale is obviously larger and more cognizant of what's necessary. And then I think, short of that, you asked me about what a Starmer government should do in the UK. Clearly, there's also, we shouldn't be defeatist. There is the strategy of establishing what you might call kind of islands of sanity, do local things. We could be talking about rather a large scale with the resources of substantial states like those in Europe or those elsewhere in Asia. There are very substantial changes that can be made that require a continuity of policy, and that's what you folks are all in the business of trying to devise. I do think that I'm open-minded on the issue of how you devise fiscal resiliency, but it is key because it's the most fungible pot of resources. It's the most powerful balance sheet. It's crucial to the range of options that you have. We just shouldn't be under an delusion about the fact that that by itself can offer us a systemic answer. It's always going to leave you in larger or lesser extent exposed to external risk. But people of goodwill are clearly all operating in those two spaces of trying to work through the organizations that do exist and then trying to create spaces in which something like a rational policy is possible. Anyway, sorry to end on such a general note. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Adam. It felt like a tsunami of ideas, emotions. I found myself alternating between hope on the green transition and doom. But anyway, shall we take some questions? I can see in the audience, I'm sure some question will come. Yes, we'll take maybe three of us, Philip and Michael.
Hi, thank you, Adam. I think I share your sense of magnitude, the way that you go through describing the moment that we live in today, but I'm also struck by how much that is shaped by the fact that this is our presence now. We obviously can't tell the future, nor could anybody who was living in the past foresee the future. And so if I'm comparing my level of freak out right now, to my potential level of freak out had I lived in, say, 1923. I'm not sure if maybe then I would have said, well, there could be full communism within the next 10 years. I should be freaking out about that. And everything is going to change. The entire world is going to turn topsy-turvy, and who knows how that's going to end. We know now how it didn't, and in that case, since you did a lot of work on the interwar period and have spent so much time thinking about the different countries, different places who were working creatively, who were trying to find their way into this new world, some of which failed spectacularly, some of which maybe we are still drawing inspiration from today. Can you talk a little bit about, if we were to look there, what's there that is interesting?
Michael?
Michael Jacobs. Hello, Adam. Brilliant as always. I wanted to pick up on the one bit of hope that you offered in the middle, was about Africa. Very interesting remarks about Africa. I think the population issue, and that Africa's never had a population anything like this, is very significant. But you pointed out that Africa now has quite a lot of the things that the West wants, and indeed China wants. And there are, William Ruto, the president of Kenya, is the person who's been articulating this most clearly, with the advice of a bunch of people. I don't know whether you know them, the Climate Action Platform for Africa organization, on climate positive growth, basically saying that Africa has the people and the natural resources to support a global green transition, not just its own green transition. And part of that is minerals, but part of it is nature, and the possibility that the rest of the world might actually pay to support some of the nature that will help sequester carbon and so on. And he is rejecting in this, he's not only suggesting this is an economic possibility, but he's rejecting the kind of victim mentality that Africa has had for so long in international affairs, in which it has to get aid and so on. And he's got into trouble from other African countries and LDCs and so on for not sticking to the kind of agreed G77 lines on this. And I just wondered whether you can imagine, or you can give us your sense of whether there is an African geopolitical strategy that fits into this picture that might change some of the dynamics, or whether Africa is simply too weak, despite these possible hopes or ambitions to do that.
Thank you. I think there was a question here. No? Otherwise, there is one here. And then maybe we'll leave you respond, and we'll take another round of questions.
I'm Michael Sachs from Wits University in South Africa, and it's maybe related to this. Isn't the most obvious and simple impact on the prospect for development the fact that the unipolar moment has passed, and Africa and others in the developing world now once again have the opportunity to trade off against various global world powers? We might not like the way they use that opportunity. As you mentioned, we lost the Sahel, but the fact that that opportunity is there could be used positively in the future.
Oh, these are great questions. If I could address the first one first. Yeah, I wrote a book about the coming of the 20th century called Deluge, that started really with the way in which people viewed the 100 years ahead of them. And I think that they deserve more credit than you give them. Because if you read Hobson on imperialism, who was the great inspiration for Lenin on imperialism, one thing that Hobson says flat out in 1903 or 4 is that the future of China decides the future of the world, full stop. There were various scenarios for China at that moment. China could disintegrate. China could become the victim of other people's imperialism, in which case the country that imperializes China will emerge as the dominant one in East Asia. That's the Japanese scenario, or the Russian scenario, or for that matter, the British and the American, or the French. And then China could consolidate as a powerful nation state, in which case the world of global power is forever changed. And all I'm saying is that contingency has now transpired, and smart people 100 years ago could see it, and they would look at our world and say, yeah, when that happens, it's game over. Or rather, finally, the great game really begins. I mean, my view is that sustainable development was thought in the moment of the 2000s through 2010 through the lens of failed states, failed state paradigm, resource conflicts leading to violence. So the idea was if you'd got sustainable development all around, it would lead to pacification. If you actually think of sustainable development as like China's, it's actually just simply another word for multipolarity. When we have sustainable development all around, we will have 8.5 billion people organized in competent nation states at levels of GDP that make them at least as capable as Ethiopia or more. And then the world of geopolitics finally is upon us. That's when it gets interesting. That's when we actually have to do global politics, and that is not within the unipolar framework, that is not within a previously League of Nations vision of European states imperializing with Japan as an outlier. We're on the cusp of actually entering that period, and China is obviously, but India now following suit. This is the first time humanity has actually had at least half of it acting within the framework of extremely competent nation states. And it turns out that even though the prices of high-level militarism have escalated, medium-level militarism is cheap. Russia is fighting the Ukraine war on the budget as a budget of 78% of GDP. That's how much they can go on doing this forever, right? Turkey is intervening in a very major way in conflicts all around it with mid-level technology that's accessible to Turkey as a success, in relative terms, successful EM market. We know how competent many of the players are emerging, regional powers emerging all around. So that would be this is even before we get to the environmental level. And at some level, we have to have a limits to growth framework. And at some level, we've got to call it and say, right, okay, Malthus was wrong. Right, okay, coal wasn't exhausted. But now, surely, our bet anyway, collectively, is this climate thing's for real. We actually think there is a carbon budget, in which case we now see it and we're up against it. And heaven help us, like our best bet clearly is to take that absolutely for real, in which case our problems are unlike any previous group, right? This is actually a Malthusianism, or Malthus isn't even the right, it's a problem we have with Malthus, right? But this is a recognition. For me, the two things go together. Insofar as we imagine geopolitics as essentially a kind of abstract game between n number of players, it kind of has a limitless and also repeatable quality. If you think of it actually as geopoliticians mean, in other words, as a map with a particular logic, as it fills up with competent players, the game changes. As the carbon budget gets exhausted, the game changes. Right? It's not the same game as before because we're much closer to the limit, which is why China's explosive growth based on coal is so fundamental, because it expires that carbon budget at a much more rapid pace. That's not a moral statement. That's just a consequential statement in terms of how the scope, for instance, for India or Africa's development now, because whatever they do, their development has, in some sense, to feed a different route. These points about agency, I mean, I'm under the impression of just having taught my colleague Howard French's book, Born in Blackness, which I recommend to everyone, because it historically relativizes this moment where we go, oh, Africa has something we want, I think in somebody's phrase. Like that was historically the norm. Like there have been a few periods in which Africa didn't have things that the West wanted. But from his argument, I think very compelling, is that from the early modern period onwards, it was actually that both the discovery of real and the imaginary wealth of Africa followed then by the opening up of chattel slavery, which drove the entire dynamic of the West. So this is not new, this configuration. But the point that he makes incredibly powerfully is that position can empower. But the question, of course, is who it empowers and on what terms and what consequences that empowering has within the domestic political and economic circumstances of Africa itself. Right? So there are a whole cluster of African states that grow extremely dynamically as providers to the chattel slavery system, because they'd always been in the slaving business, and all of a sudden the slavery business was going to generate huge flows of revenue and weapons and interesting commodities, not largely from Europe, but from India, that could be imported, right? And that became an incredibly toxic dynamic for African state formation, which leads to the disasters and tragedies of the 18th and 19th century and continues on East Africa all the way down to the end of the 19th century. So that is the crucial question. Like, to what extent are African states capable of exploiting this moment of opportunity? And it is a hugely high risk situation to be in. It is a situation of opportunity, but it is also a situation of huge risk, because internal factions, internal interests will coalesce around one strategy or the other. The choices can become existential. Like in many cases, neutrality would be a better place to be in. You don't have to go to the resource curse simplicity to kind of recognize the risks that are at stake here. It's as the Germans would say, Zerreißprobe, a testing, a tearing test, right? Can your polity cohere if it wants to exploit these kind of advantages? And after all, the Cold War is not exactly a promising example of how this played out in state after state after state in Africa, right? These interventions, and Wagner is, that the West has made so much fuss out of, is kind of pale beer. I mean, what strikes me more, maybe there are people in the room who can really feel it, is the kind of ideological emptiness of this wave of coups that have swept across the Sahel. Like, what are they actually about? Like, it's very unclear. These are very unlike the high stakes ideological battles of the 60s through the 80s in post-colonial Africa. It's not obvious. They seem to me to fit into this exhaustion paradigm, where it's like the déjà coup, like, you know, we've kind of been here before. And of course, it's not true. That too is a trope, right? It's not true that everyone, you know, the coups are not a generality of experience. They're specific logics, but so far, very few of them seem to have like a clear, compelling ideological political purpose that would betoken, why that would be interesting is, it would betoken a state building project. It would betoken an elite that actually had some self-confidence, that had substantial societal backing, that was driving in a particular direction. And that, for better or worse, is the only thing that will turn these gambles into really viable projects. And many of those trade-offs are going to be really dirty. The cases I know best are all European, but the European states that try to play this kind of game often ended up in authoritarian solutions because the authorities need to repress the dissenting views within the state that contest the choices that you're making globally, the alliances that you enter into, right? So you're trying to attract a Chinese bidder. This mobilizes nationalist opposition. People in the prevailing regime that want to do the Chinese deal end up repressing the opposition. You see this in Serbia right now in Europe, right? You saw that in the interwar period. These kind of logics are very powerful. So it certainly changes the pressure, but there isn't much in the historical record in general, or of Africa in particular, that leads one to be per se optimistic. You have to be a very competent state to play this game to the advantage of anything but small elites. And that is the challenge. That doesn't foreclose the option, but I would have thought that is the challenge for mass political and for democratic politics in Africa today, is to formulate a foreign policy and a foreign economic policy that does indeed take advantage of the end of unipolarity in a productive way. And that's a huge, I don't think even Europe right now, I don't trust the German political system to digest the implications of multipolarity. And I say that laughingly because I know that system reasonably well, and it is undoubtedly a sophisticated one. But they seem to me, I give this talk about the war crisis in Germany because I don't think people in Berlin understand how flipping dangerous this is. And they are in the loop. They are privileged players, they have resource, and I don't think they understand how dangerous this is, and how far for progressive and left-wing politics everywhere in the world, and in Europe as well, the question of peace is being posed now. It's an old question. It was one that was very dangerous for the left in the 1980s. We're kind of back in that space now. So see what I mean? Generalizing from that to the specific challenges of much more fragile states, it's quite unclear how this works out.
More questions? Yes, please.
And over here.
One here.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So my question has to do with, well, you could argue that EU and US should just let China build the infrastructure in Africa, not try to compete in that, and really focus on their relative strength, which is to improve education in Africa. And what is preventing essentially achieving an improvement in education similar to what happened in China in the 70s, 80s, when China was as poor as many African countries at the time?
Yes, good. The questions that get asked in these discussions are so mind-blowing. Yeah, there's one over here.
Yeah, let's take.
Thank you. Rashad Amra from Wits University as well. This is a room primarily made up of policymakers or people involved in policy, and we talk a lot about orthodoxy, and there's a lot of groupthink over here, and especially emerging from post-Bretton Woods and Washington Consensus, and then changes to Washington Consensus have been very much on the margin. But will there still be in a new world, a consensus or best practice, given that the underlying institutions and the powers behind that consensus or advocating those best practices cease to be, it becomes a lot more anarchic, where the BRICS grouping with the new entrants doesn't seem to have any orthodoxy besides growth. So skirting Geneva, skirting the Human Rights Declaration, skirting, not even caring too much about WTO, or any of these that have emerged post Washington Consensus. So does it become very much the law of the jungle? And then you notice even the Germans aren't able to navigate the consequences or the implications of the new world. So what is then the implication for the ODI, for the World Bank, for the IMF, and the rest of us here? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have one here, and Yamini, and then we'll take responses.
Yeah, I actually stopped, Adam. At a point, I was thinking whether we should all pack out of West Africa. At a point, when I saw the map of how inhabitant some part of the world would be in Africa, especially in the next by 2070, I started thinking whether I should pack out of West Africa and move away, because the whole of West Africa is entirely black. But my question is, shouldn't polycrisis be an African AU agenda for the heads of states to start discussing? And how do you think this can improve the African continental free trade area that we've all been talking about? That with these opportunities that we have, can we leverage on the availability of raw materials in Africa and have a common front to improve the condition as it is?
Question here.
So it's actually, he articulated my question better than I would have, but let me push that a little bit. So in this multipolar world where multiple actors are being able to play in the big boys club, so to speak, it's also being played very much from the internal perspective of individual national interest. And it is multiplicities of national interests that seem to be jostling with one another, which in the old world always existed too, except that you had one big bully that was able to, put everybody, get everyone in line. And as you rightly pointed out, the challenges, the domestic challenges in the United States are significant. And in fact, they are not unknown to the rest of the world at one level, which is why everybody is now sort of pushing out in their own national interest as a way of grabbing the moment, so to speak. So the bigger question is the crisis of climate enough to create a normative framework that can be disciplining? Otherwise, how are we going to evolve a disciplined global norm? And I ask this question also from the perspective of this, there's this creature called the Global South, which I still haven't quite figured out what it means. But it's a phrase that we use all the time, and India has adopted it big time in the context of G22. And now we are all coming together as, leaders of the Global South. And there's new jostling around whether it's China who's leading the Global South or India who's leading the Global South. But, it's this coming together of a new formation with absolutely no normative basis on which this Global South agenda is to be pursued. So again, how do you, are we just going to see lots of chaos minus that global norm? And, just your thoughts on that.
Well, what a range of questions. It's clearly Europe and Africa need to be partners, right? Because if they're not, it's a very grim outlook indeed. I think that's the one thing that we can clearly say, because the flow of migration is real. It makes sense. It's logical. It's not just desperation that drives people. The people who are making that gamble, risking their lives, they're understanding something about the world. And that's the tragedy in a sense. They're acting in not just locally, but macroscopically rational way. Europe needs their labor, and they make a contribution anyway. But they're caught in a system that tragically refuses that that logic and refuses to organize it in a civilized way that would maximize opportunities and allow resources, you were saying, education to flow both ways. I mean, we were talking about this earlier on. The agony of the current moment is that these things which we describe as big in relation to the scale of the problem and the scale of global resource, a global GDP of 100 trillion a year, are not big. They're not big. This problem of organizing of migrant labor and the flow that will be necessary by historical standards is not insurmountable, and it's impossible to render it that way. And yet, when we say all of this, can we really be optimistic about the prospects for that deal, which is obviously strategically essential for both sides? And if you think about, say, 2017, the Merkel government after the shock of 2015, 2016 has the right idea. They understand. I mean, Merkel truly was at that level. Everyone says she was not visionary. She actually understood globalization probably better and more profoundly than any European politician ever before her. She understood that there needed to be a strategy for Europe in Africa, because otherwise you were constantly trying to, she was a realist too. She would do the deal with Erdogan, but there needed to be a plan and a strategy. And so there is the German-led Marshall Plan, not for, but with Africa, which is launched, God help us, into the spring of 2017 and the Trump administration. And that's one thing that kills it. And the other thing that kills it is the German finance ministry, because the German Marshall Plan with Africa was a public-private partnership with an absolute minimal amount of rebadging of existing funds, which were supposed to be leveraged up and would end you up with, I think they thought it would be 150 billion over some long time frame. And you're looking at Nigeria, or Ghana, and just going, folks, you're not on the right, you're not in the planet, right? We're talking about large-scale problems. And that's where this is where for me, this sense of kind of, not panic exactly, but real fear, not fear again, but just apprehension. Because the logic is so transparent, the need is so transparent, the means are minimal, the outcomes will be win-win. And yet I don't see how anyone in the room will be confident that we're going to get to that kind of scale. And we invoke the Marshall Plan because it's sort of our comfort blanket of big policy that went right at a crucial moment, and at least once, right? It really did. And even there, one could be revisionist about it, but nevertheless, that for me is the sort of, couldn't agree with you more. That is clearly what needs to happen. I'm not persuaded that necessarily would. A similar kind of response to your point about education. And of course, the contrasting case is India. When the World Bank went into China in the early 1980s, they just couldn't understand the planet they were on, because this was a country with a measured GDP per capita very similar to India's, and yet it ticked all the boxes on the basic development agenda. It ticked the boxes on health, it ticked the boxes on basic education, it had done everything right, and hey presto, when you did the minimal amount of liberalization, you did in fact get very rapid market-driven growth. Right? And the problem, of course, is if you ask what the conditions are for the possibility of the realization of that program in China, I'm not even going to cite Chinese historians. I'll just cite Indian colleagues that I spoke to on a visit that Yamini and CPI made possible. And we're there a few, maybe one beer into the evening, people will say, well, we never had a cultural revolution. We never had a cultural revolution. And these are not subaltern studies radicals from the 1970s talking, for whom that was always the point, right? This is our people. So the thing which you're describing, which is clearly the central route, right? Grassroots health, grassroots education. Insofar as we have a kind of standard policy set, that's clearly the way to go. The problem in that case is that's not a small fix, that's a massive societal transformation. Because that goes into the heart of how people understand their children, and notably their girl children, how they fit into visions of their future. This is, and in the same level, you could say that in the migration policy, for instance, again, it's fundamentally a question of whether white people can live in peace with black people on a large scale in Europe, notably if those people are of Muslim heritage, right? That's kind of the fundamental deep resistance that lies behind, the difficulty. We've seen the difference with Ukraine. Like it's just an undeniable natural experiment of really dramatic implications. So the option is there. This isn't fatalistic. This isn't to say that division of labor is not a good division of labor, the one you propose. By all means, let the Chinese do infrastructure and let the Europeans work on education. That doesn't seem like a bad division. The question from the Chinese side is whether they're still doing it. Like if you look at the net flow numbers, they're at zero or even negative now. That story is over. That's an old story. I mean, right now, the ambition should be, in fact, to enroll the Chinese in a new phase of expansion to provide conditions in which they can do it safely. But of course, the opposite is what we're trying to do. We're trying to use $2 billion here, there, or everywhere else to outcompete the Chinese in a space as though the United States and the West in its current configuration came even close, 2 orders of magnitude close, to actually filling that space. You define the Indo-Pacific and then you think you can fill it with $2.5 billion. It's a joke. Right? It's an absurd misunderstanding of the scale of the development issues of Southeast Asia, for instance. Like so this for me has this weird placeholder function. There's an awful lot of politics going down right now, which you can read from, say, the critical perspective as grand visions of neoliberal policy in its death throes. I'm transitioning to the question from over here. But on the other hand, it also just has this spectral kind of, it's as though we're box ticking. We need a policy for that. We're going to string it together like this. This is how we're going to make it work. I read that on the American side very much as the effort by this frankly traumatized liberal elite to keep the train, to keep the truck on the road. And heaven knows that's the only option, and all power to them. But there's a way in which they need a quick fix or they need a fix more than actually the reality of a solution. So this is kind of symptomatic that the ubiquity of references to Swiss Army knife policies is telling in this respect, because obviously Swiss Army knives are very clever things. But if you ever face a major emergency with a Swiss Army knife, you're in trouble. If that's what you're left with, Godspeed. And that is, the IRA is a Swiss Army knife, literally, in that sense, I think. It's this intensely clever way of packing everything, including the future of American democracy, into, no, literally, that is its main focus. That's what they care about most. And so this comes to this ideological point, like what actually has broken and what is emerging. I mean, amongst all of the Biden economics chutzpah, the most dramatic is no doubt the Jake Sullivan moment where he says to Brookings, and some people call this a new Washington consensus, on the back of a vice president's vote in the Senate, they get this thing passed and they call it a new Washington consensus. It's absolutely hilarious. I mean, it's just spinning into space, right? Clearly within the think tank world, amongst folks like us, we've all been discussing little else about the new industrial policy and everything else, and they've won the argument and everyone's persuaded. But the fundamental difference is that their project does not have behind it a powerfully packed coalition of social and economic interests and a clear vision, or a realizable vision, like the original Washington consensus did, right? In the 90s, you could do NAFTA on the back of a bipartisan coalition. You could do China's WTO accession on the back of a bipartisan coalition in Washington. Obviously, it's easier for Republicans to mobilize those because Democrats will actually vote on an issue rather than the Republicans who just hardline now. But nevertheless, that's all gone. The very last thing they have is a consensus on anything. Insofar as there's a consensus, it would be a hardline on China. But even that has different edges, right? This goes to this issue of national interest. Like the harder edge Republicans, the committee to watch is the House Committee on whatever it's called, on China, and it isn't called that, but countering the influence of the CCP, because they are posing the question, Yamini, that you're talking about in a really subversive and kind of aggressive way, because it's true that now people are using this term national interest to mobilize around, but we all know that's just an empty vessel. I mean, national interest is what I happen on any given day to say it is for my purposes, for pursuing whatever, because there's no really, I mean, maybe in a war when you're facing a totalitarian invader, and Poland had a national interest in resisting Nazi occupation. The Soviet Union did too. That's a reasonable statement. But America has a national interest in humbling and crippling the development of Chinese tech at the risk of potential confrontation and escalation towards a war with Taiwan. Europeans, when asked the question of whether they would solidarize with America in a war over Taiwan, overwhelmingly, in opinion polling done by the ECFR, rejected that proposition. No, they're not interested in it. They don't know. And what this House committee is doing is exposing the deep interests of a whole range of very important and strategically significant American business groups in China, and their continued interest in it. And they will, of course, all merrily argue these are American jobs, American shareholders. This is good for the American economy. Remember, like 10 years ago, we all agreed on this. And that is really what I see is that we've jumped the national interest topic into the policy frame. And it's a crazy hot potato that on the one hand, everyone wants to hold, and on the other hand, no one wants to. It's kind of radioactive, right? It's very, very unstable. Brexit, after all, living in this country, you know, like Brexit was in Britain's national interest.
Clearly.
Yeah. So no, and that's how it was justified. Like, and maybe they had a case, but it's proved incredibly difficult to actually make it work. Now the question about ideology, I mean, you can guess like where I would probably go with this from these other answers, which is that I don't yet see the coalescence of anything remotely like the Washington consensus. That may have something to do with the difficulty of defining what national interest is. If we've defined national interest as the hard core of the new frame, it's incredibly, I mean, think of India. I mean, it turns out that the national interest of India is to rename India. Like literally give it a new name. Like, and thereby a whole new conception of what it is, right? So it doesn't, it's incredibly unstable. And I think we'll have a clearer idea if and when, like as you were saying, a new coalition of forces emerges. And I think, I mean, the Biden people, to give them their due, they have a vision, which is that buried within America's fraught political economy, there is in fact a green modernization coalition, like the one that you can see in Europe, like the one you can see around Adani and the green energy revolution in India, that's waiting to happen. And so the project of the Biden people is to articulate that and build a social model around it and revive. And at that point, I think you could say, okay, now we've got something that kind of works. The CCP has a kind of strategy of that type, I think, right? You deliver a certain sort of consumer benefit constrained by the very high savings rate, you develop growth, you deliver, for heaven's sake, like a private property ownership to the overwhelming majority of society in the space of 30 years. Like that's the societal project of transformation, right? And they're now having to unwind the consequences of that in financial terms. We are some way away, I think, from the coalescence of that kind of form. And my left-wing friends would say, well, yes, and for all of the churn around this, in the end, within the actual practice of neoliberalism in the United States, it was a coalition of business interests in the American state that always dominated. The least principled, least rule-following neoliberal player was always the United States. The people who really drank the Kool-Aid were the Europeans. The EU is like the full Monty, right? They really committed with the limitations on state aid, with the, you know, in 2019, the Commission stopped the merger of Siemens and Alstom. You know, it's like in the present world, an unfathomable but thoroughly principled. Down the line, it has real consequences. Cell phones are much cheaper in Europe than anywhere else, than in the United States. Airline travel's dirt cheap as well, right? So it's a real political economy, but it was never the American model anyway. Right? It was called the Washington Consensus for a reason. They decided what it was, and they called the shots, and they played by it. And this reading of power is really essential. And furthermore, if you look into the architecture of all of these new industrial policy measures, as Daniela Gabor is, you know, showing this with real force, it's, you know, it's basically the same old wine in new bottles, right? It's the same old mechanisms organized around the same players, because there has been no change in the underlying political economy, right? But the neoliberalism was founded on a dramatic shift in the balance of power, freeing of finance to an extent we hadn't seen since the 1930s. None of that is active in the current moment. And so in the end, it remains true that the fiscal capacity of the state is highly limited. So you use public-private partnership to compensate for that. Like there's a kind of continuity there that we have to reckon with. The situation, I think, is more precarious, as I was trying to highlight in the American case, than it is transformed so far. We're in this sort of situation of really extreme. And with regard to political economy, how much difference would a Trump administration make? Well, it would probably try and kill the IRA, but and it would be even more aggressive on trade. It would be even more disruptive in international institutions. But at this point, the Biden administration is in any case a kind of rationalized, more intellectualized, more sophisticated version of Trump's policy, you could say. And so to that extent, a reversion back, it will be hugely destabilizing for. But in terms of your question about it would be hugely destabilizing for global politics and for the American Constitution. But in terms of your question about economic ideology and political economy, I'm not sure how much difference it would end up making.
We have one question. There is one question online.
There was somebody here that raised their hand.
Yes, Tim. So, yes, please.
Thank you very much. I must say I've been more educated, but I have fears. Let me be specific with the fear. You ended your presentation by saying we should allow the islands, particularly so from Africa, I'm from Africa, or the developing country, to build sanity, competency, and consistency.
Yeah.
From your presentation, I don't hear any recommendation from you on how these small islands in the developing countries can build those three competencies you're talking about. And related to that, what do you see the role of the international agencies and the regional organizations helping those small islands grow into sanity, integrity, independence, consistency, and competency? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There is a question online from Ratin Roy, who unfortunately couldn't be here. So he quoted you this morning and quotes again yourself, well, Keynote, if you can do it, then you can afford it. We know the scale of the green and inequality challenges, but are we able to, or do we know how to address them, if not fully, in substantial measure? And I think that comes a little bit around Yamini's idea whether we could mobilize ourselves around the climate. Yeah. And then Tim, yes.
Hi, I'm Tim Williamson from the World Bank. And at the bank, we've been doing some work on the future of government. It's a grand title. And we sort of looked back and we ended up with a fairly optimistic view that, looking back, governments have together managed to address thus far a lot of the global crises that they faced, and this is a challenge, and it requires a degree of collective action, both at the macro level, but also within countries themselves, and depending on the context and the nature of challenges, the crises are different, but it requires a degree of sort of joint working to solve those problems. But I am an optimist, but one of my sort of question to you, having listened to you, and you sort of say, and I think all the solutions are out there, and there's a way of doing this, but really, do things have to get a lot worse before they get better?
God, such a lot of. So we've got the Keynes question, we have the outstanding Yamini question, we have the question I can't answer,
the
competence like how to do it question, and then we have do things have to get worse? Because when they get worse, presumably there's some sort of logic which says that when faced with crisis, people act. So there's a huge gulf between my confidence in responding to this question and my real trepidation in trying to respond to the totally fair question from the back here. I genuinely don't think I should venture in a because the question you're asking is the question, essentially the question of development, right? Of political and economic and social development. And you folks in the room here are the people who have competence and expertise and devoted your lives to that issue, and that makes me feel out of my depth, to be honest, to actually specifically answer your question, right? And in a prospective and normative way. But maybe one point I could make, which isn't entirely evasive, would be to say something along the lines of, in a room of technocrats or of policymakers, the thing in this kind of community that and I would count myself in that kind of group as a kind of, an external observer of that process, the thing we tend to underestimate is the significance of politics per se, politics. So the combination of the mobilization of popular participation, the shaping of discourse, the matter of leadership, the way in which, not to get into a kind of moralistic discourse about clean government and corruption, but the way in which the flow of resources is managed within the elite and between the elite and broader society. We underestimate the political. In part, we underestimate the political because it's so damn contingent, and it's so particular, and it's so case by case, and there's no single formula that lies there. The general point I'm making is just that without that, it seems almost impossible to imagine substantial progress on any of the big metrics, any of the big axes of advance that we're talking about. And any advance that you do make, absent the development of a complex, at least minimally pluralistic, open political system, is always going to be fragile. It's always going to be contingent. You got lucky once, right? But you don't really have any resilience in the system. And that would be like the one, it's not an answer to your question, it's saying that this is one of the dimensions of development that seem to me to be essential. And I say this in part also as a historian because of its contingency, right? Certain projects will work. There are certain moments where decisions will differentiate between societies which make systematic progress on certain dimensions and others that don't. And I know that's at some level a cop-out, but I've just been teaching a class literally 90 minutes ago about German history and German development, and there's such a temptation in thinking about the disasters that country went through in the early 20th century to think of them as determined by broad socioeconomic factors and to discount the significance of political choice for better and worse at key moments. The foundation of the state in part of a Bismarckian conservative strategy in the 1870s, the choices of political elites in the Weimar Republic. And those can be explained in various ways, but we end up in a kind of Tolstoyan regress where we have to account for both the general and the particular. And what I came away from rethinking the history of the country that I know best is that in the end, you can't escape the significance of political choice. It's kind of the Lee Kuan Yew kind of Singaporean case. And that is not, that's a kind of, it's a hopeless answer from the point of view of social science because it's so contingent that it's very difficult, I think, to avoid. There are certain lessons that can follow from that, which are the developmental implications of free institutions, of independent judiciaries, a multiplicity and plurality of institutions that create checks and balances would seem to be the way to go. So anything which develops a check and balance logic would seem to be a key step in the right direction. I'm much more confident in responding at the level of like macroeconomic policy to your point from. I think it's undeniable that in the responses to the 2008 crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the 2020 crisis, there has been policy learning. Absolutely. Absolutely undeniable that that's the case. It would be crazy to tell the story any other way. I'm unpersuaded, though, by the logic that says we really need a big disaster to act at scale. And furthermore, I'm just not sure that we can afford disasters on the scale that are coming down the pike. And that is a lesson. I don't mean to cast aspersions, but it's much easier said from the position of privilege that we all inhabit than from the position of the people who will actually suffer the crisis, in its extreme form. That to my mind, that's not a tenable position, right? So I don't derive any optimism from that. That makes me very pessimistic. If that is the conclusion of the study, we're in real trouble. There's a hand which went up immediately. Do you want to pile in on this?
If everybody has to go on the toilet, I can still ask a question.
But was that triggered by what I just said? Because if it was, we can.
No, I was just thinking if I have
Right.
So I was wondering, Collier, because you were talking about the coup d'etat in the Sahel, and Collier proposed European security guarantees towards democratically elected governments. I was wondering what's your opinion on that.
Okay,
Thanks
so we can fold that into the kind of learning process. There are clearly ways in which powerful states might want to secure other states against risks. The problem, of course, is what's a European security guarantee worth in a zone in which Europe has been trying to organise and guarantee security for over a decade with inadequate results. If it was a security guarantee of a large scale, that might be an answer, right? If it was really large scale, like the early phase of the French intervention, but over the long run, that hasn't proved to be a satisfactory answer. Various backstop mechanisms, deep-pocketed backstop mechanisms, I think are something we've learned are crucial, which is why the nexus between central banks and treasuries is crucial, right? Maintaining a powerful nexus between a central bank and a treasury is the crucial thing. And I gather that the British example of last year has been much in debate. To me, that's not a demonstration of what goes wrong when you have crazy policy. That's the demonstration of what goes wrong when you no longer have that nexus between the central bank and the treasury operating. Because as soon as you put that back in place, the problem goes away, as the British case demonstrates, right? So now, of course, you can say over the long run, that's toxic because then people start gaming this system. But that's then a matter of institution building, transparency, accountability to regulate that balance. The crisis was eminently avoidable. It need never have happened. It was a choice to let it happen. It's not the first time the Bank of England has played that kind of game in its long history. So, but the function of a backstop, right, is a really important thing that I think policy has learned. The Fed did this in 2020, right, announcing that it would buy private debt on a large scale, a huge transgression of conventional boundaries. Never actually had to do it. Right? Never had to do it on any scale. Right? Because once you make the promise, you realize the mechanism to take your point, confidence restores, security is reestablished. It's the promise that means that the predators, the bond vigilantes never, or in other words, the insurgents in a Central African situation never get going because they know at some point they'll face retribution of a large scale. I don't think that's a bad way of thinking about the kind of contingent policy we're going to need going forward. And so a kind of, to go to the orthodoxy problem, a minimum of orthodoxy, a maximum of pragmatism, a maximum mobilization of standing reserves of capacity to act. Some balance like this is as good as we've got, right? It's not a guarantee of anything, but it's as good as we've got. I'll just recur to Yamanu's point about climate because it's such an extraordinary thing, right? That's happened in which climate has moved from being the 1990s south on north mud bath like slanging match of the 90s to the heartbreak of Copenhagen and the realization that there was no possible deal, to happy clappy Paris 2015. We've kind of agreed. And now it's like the last thread of sanity in a global system in which we hope the climate problem will yield norms that allow us to organize a collective system that is otherwise fraying. It's really an astonishing trajectory. Yes. And I don't think it's by accident. I think there are other ecological problems which are still much more dangerous in a way than climate's become it's literally become the thing that we think we can maybe organize a collective human interest around. And I'm very skeptical that that's any longer really possible to any extent, not because the logic isn't totally sound, obviously. And in fact, it's the most dramatic demonstration of the broader transition, your point about multipolarity, right? The climate is the space in which the West discovers for the first time, I think, in modern history, that its fate is absolutely not in its own hand. Right? The G7 between them account for less emissions than China on its own. The United States is less than 13% of global compared to 31% for China. Nothing America can do any longer shapes by itself the outcome here. Right? So it is the ultimate global political problem, because it's also true that China, of course, can't by itself achieve decarbonisation because it's only 31% of the problem. So, and my sense is that from that emerges not necessarily a kind of solid set of norms, but surely what we're basically gambling on is that rivalrous national processes unleash a technological logic which is so persuasive by itself that this just, in a depoliticized way, in the end, works its way through. But I'm doing the ironies here are there's so many of them, and I'll just end on this. But this argument, it's this argument that we can't afford to do geopolitics now because the climate problem supervenes. Like, how on earth can we be talking about Ukraine and war and confrontation, whereas the climate problem, collectively speaking, is the result of the multipolarity that drives the process, right? So they're two sides of the same coin, that as collectively a planet with our collective population mobilizes to the level we currently do, simultaneously we reach the boundary of this is my answer to you, right? We simultaneously reach the boundary of the environmental envelope, and the geopolitical game rises to a entirely new level. And unless we embrace that and stop I feel there's like this 1990s, we kind of want the 1990s unipolar moment back, in which we can somehow all agree, which is how the climate problem was originally framed back then, right? And we're not in that space. The real climate problem is one of development all around, right? Or at least for half of humanity on a really large scale. And that's what's blowing us towards this dramatic conclusion. So I don't see, it can't be I don't think a universal norm thing is going to work. It's got to be something more bargained or de facto depoliticized by virtue of the fact that it's just technology that's going to get us there.
Maybe it's not a bad way to finish on something that is a little bit perhaps more optimistic. Thank you so much, Adam. We heard clearly a failure of scale. So the new, the international economic order is a little bit of a dire state, but there are pockets of hope. And also what I take away is that even if there is a failure of scale, doesn't mean that nothing can be done. And there are those small islands of rational and actually good. I also hear that tax base remain fundamental. So I think it's a very solid basis for us to go and get a drink and enjoy ourselves, but also to come tomorrow for the second part of this conference. But let me, please join me to thank very much.